So this week's PowerPoint lecture is on getting people to the table. Getting people to the table. What if you threw a negotiation and no one came? So refusing to talk is a time-honored tradition in conflict, particularly of more powerful parties. If they are holding all the cards, why should they talk to you? This is like your boss saying, these are the work conditions, show up or forget it. They're holding all the cards, right? So, how are you supposed to negotiate with that? But remember, that's what bettering your BATNA is all about. Trying to make sure the other side is not holding all the cards. And if you're finding yourself with no cards in your hand, trying to figure out a way to create some so that that power imbalance is not as imbalanced. The first thing you want to do in trying to get people to the table is to identify all of the stakeholders. And perhaps in a conflict with your roommate or your spouse or your immediate boss, this isn't that complicated. You're the people that should be at the table. In a broader family conflict, a broader workplace issue conflict, and certainly in our conflicts in our communities, it may be harder to identify everyone who should be there at the table. So if all the power holders are not at the table, it may very well be impossible to resolve the conflict. I'll give you an example. I'm in public interest litigation right now, and the opponents on the other side of this conflict regarding a road construction in Burlington are the FHWA, the Federal Highway Administration, Vermont Agency of Transportation, and the City of Burlington. There is no point in really even having dialogue with one of those parties and not with the remainder of them, because we can't resolve the conflict about building this highway unless all three of those power holders are at the table. It also may be unethical to resolve a conflict of all the people if all the people who are being harmed or affected are not at the table. This does happen in litigation all the time. A particular environmental organization, for example, may sue over, say, a pollution issue, or you have something where, hundreds of people have been harmed by a toxic pollutant in the water, and 5 of the families get together and hire attorneys and sue and get a settlement, but everybody else who was also harmed isn't there at the table. So it's, good to think about at least who else is being affected by this, and can we ethically or even effectively resolve it. In litigation, sometimes someone will enter a resolution, an agency or a public body will enter a resolution with one set of affected members of the public or a nonprofit organization, and then 3 other people come along and sue who weren't party to that agreement. That doesn't help anybody, because then the resolution itself can't be implemented. Where is the table? Think about what is the table. That is, what is the forum where you're going to have your resolution dialogue? If there isn't one, you're going to need to create one. In your family, if you got an argument with your spouse or your siblings, could literally be the dinner table. The table is the table. At work, could be a regularly scheduled meeting or a break time. And in public policy conflicts, there could be a committee hearing or a meeting or legislative session. So think about, where is this conflict actually happening and where is it going to be resolved? So, how do you bring people to the table? One technique, if you've already earnestly tried to ask them to talk and they won't sit down at that table and talk, is you might enlist third-party pressure. That can be someone in the context of the relationship or an outside party and entity. Do be aware that bringing in an outside person or entity can be viewed by the other side as a hostile act. So think over that balance. Okay, is it they're going to be mad because you brought in, this neighbor or this other person, or, went over their head to another boss, but you're going to be able to actually sit down and talk things through if they're not listening or refusing to talk. So how does that work? and consider your BATNA there as well. Some third-party possibilities in your family, within the context of the family, would be another family member or a trusted friend. And outside that family context would be maybe a doctor or counselor or a clergy person, maybe someone else who your opponent in that conflict actually, respects and works with on an ongoing basis already. At work, on the inside of your work relationship, could be your coworkers. Look, I tried to talk to the boss, but maybe if we got 10 of us to go talk to the boss, they might have to listen. Or someone else in the management chain. And then outside the work relationship would be OSHA, health inspector, Department of Labor. Public policy, basically there's not usually the inside-outside thing. So be bringing in another elected official, another agency, a well-known public organization, a celebrity that picks up a particular cause that you're advocating for. So another technique to bring people to the table is litigation. Now, this gets a little confusing because often conflict resolution classes are actually about alternative dispute resolution, meaning alternatives to litigation. So it's a little funny to back up and think of litigation itself as a conflict resolution device. However, of course, litigation is a conflict resolution device. You've got two people with a dispute, they go to court, and it gets resolved. That is, a resolution gets imposed by a judge or a jury. So litigation can be mind-shatteringly stressful and expensive. It's not, technically speaking, violent, although if it's very stressful, it can feel that way. It can feel like a lot of harassment and ruining your life. So it depends on the context of what you're doing, and you need to think through what it's going to involve. The vast majority of mediation and negotiation occurs after someone has filed a lawsuit and the court orders you to go to mediation. Okay, this is a matter of forcing people to the table. Again, it will be viewed as hostile. You've gone and filed a lawsuit, but it is also often very effective. So you need to assess the costs, time, energy, mental health, of the litigation as part of your BATNA when you can't get the other side to negotiate. Examples of legal action to compel negotiation or mediation. In the family situation, it's divorce or custody action or a stay-away order. Any of those family court actions that you might take that force the situation into a different plane, that in the language of the Harvard Negotiation Project, what you're doing is changing the game. Okay, we've had this relationship issue going on, that's a problem. Now we're in the context of talking about it in the context of a divorce court hearing or a custody hearing. At work, you could bring lawsuits for discrimination, for wrongful termination. You could file formal legal complaints to OSHA or EOC, the health inspector, etc. And in the community or public policy field, you bring public interest litigation. That is, you sue the state or the pertinent agency for their inaction, for taking an arbitrary action, for violating their legal authority. You file an appeal of an agency decision. That's actually all the realm of litigation that I work in. Now, in the international context, this is much more complex. International courts are extremely limited and only by agreement. Every nation is sovereign and no nation can be forced into court. So there are international courts that people have agreed to, that nations have agreed to by treaties, but they are of very limited application. So sanctions, which are potentially violent when you blockade a nation so it can't get health supplies, can't get food, that's, sounds like a violent act to me. And war, which is devastatingly violent, are the ultimate international means to resolve a conflict and force nations to the table where they, quote, sue for peace. That's why they call it suing for peace. It's effectively litigation to end a bombing, litigation to end war against you. These obviously are exactly the types of conflicts we are trying to avoid through peaceful, nonviolent conflict resolution. So internationally, the most effective strategy is conflict avoidance, and that is a matter of ongoing dialogue. So the way to try to avoid these conflicts is to have nations be in communication on an ongoing basis. That happens through diplomacy, or at least it's supposed to. Different administrations are in the US are very, very different as they are in other nations as to how they perceive of the role of diplomacy. So all these ambassadors and consuls that we have in other countries and that other countries have in the US are supposed to be part of an ongoing, fluid dialogue and an interface of understanding one another's cultures and having that, level of association and relationship that may avoid a conflict. The United Nations, clearly many people are of the opinion that the United Nations is ineffective. I have to say that it is there to be a forum for ongoing conversation. It's really, really hard to get all of the nations of the world with their different languages, different culture, different perspectives to actually have meaningful dialogue, and the UN creates a place for that to happen. So it's less about what they actually accomplish. It's less about the end game than it is about the process. They are there so that there is a table for people, for nations to have conversations. There are regional organizations like the EU and the African Union that fulfill a similar mission. International NGOs like the Red Cross Green Crescent and treaty negotiations, which are contracts between nations, are also forums for ongoing dialogue to attempt to avoid international conflict that leads to these violent conflict resolution methods of sanctions and war. And just to conclude, going back full circle, ongoing dialogue when conflict is not happening is the best way really to avoid conflicts at home, work, and in our communities, as well as in the global and international sphere. So talk to people, not about people, but engage in dialogue with people, especially those you disagree with, to avoid it reaching a conflict pitch.